When most people think of serial killers, names like Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, and John Wayne Gacy immediately come to mind. These monsters dominated headlines, spawned countless documentaries, and became household names synonymous with evil. But lurking in the shadows of criminal history are killers whose crimes were just as horrific, just as calculated, and just as devastating, yet somehow they've been forgotten by mainstream culture. Today, we're diving into the darkest corners of American crime to uncover 5 of the most evil serial killers you've probably never heard of. These aren't cases where justice was never served or mysteries that remain unsolved. These are stories of pure, documented evil that somehow slipped through the cracks of public memory. We're talking about a man who turned children into candy shop victims, a grandmother who poisoned her way through her own family, a failed football player who turned America's highways into hunting grounds, a phantom who terrorized an entire city and then vanished, and a doctor who used his oath to heal as a license to kill. Each of these monsters developed their own twisted methodology, their own signature of horror, and their own trail of devastation that would haunt communities for decades. What makes these cases particularly chilling isn't just the body count or the brutality, though both are staggering. It's how these killers hid in plain sight, wearing masks of normalcy that allowed them to continue their sprees far longer than anyone imagined possible. They were the friendly neighbor, the caring medical professional, the successful athlete, the devoted family member. They understood that the best place to hide evil is behind a smile, and they perfected that deception with terrifying efficiency. The stories you're about to hear will disturb you, but they'll also reveal something crucial about the nature of evil itself. These weren't crimes of passion or moments of temporary insanity. These were calculated, methodical campaigns of terror carried out by individuals who found pleasure in the suffering of others. They planned their attacks, refined their techniques, and in some cases, built entire systems designed to facilitate murder. What's perhaps most unsettling is how close they came to never being caught at all. Our first case takes us to Houston, Texas, in the early 1970s, where a man known as the Candyman was about to orchestrate one of the most shocking mass murder cases in American history. Dean Arnold Corll didn't look like a monster. Standing 5 feet 9 inches tall, with a slight build and soft features, he appeared harmless, even friendly. Born in 1939 in Fort Wayne, Indiana, Corll moved to Houston with his family as a child when his mother started a candy-making business. It was this innocent family enterprise that would eventually provide the perfect cover for unspeakable horrors. The Corll Candy Company became a fixture in the Houston Heights neighborhood, and Dean, who worked there throughout his teens and early 20s, became known for giving away free candy to local children. Parents saw him as a kind, generous young man who was good with kids. Children knew him as the nice man who handed out sweets and sometimes offered them jobs helping around the candy factory. What no one realized was that Dean Corll was using these interactions to study his potential victims, learning their routines, gaining their trust, and identifying which children might not be missed immediately if they disappeared. Corll's transformation from candy maker to killer wasn't sudden. Like many serial killers, he escalated gradually, and his early warning signs were either missed or dismissed. During his brief stint in the military, fellow soldiers noted his unusual behavior around younger recruits, but in the hierarchical structure of the Army, such observations rarely led to formal complaints. When he returned to Houston and took over more responsibilities at the family candy business, neighbors occasionally mentioned seeing him with teenage boys at odd hours, but in the early 1970s, such observations were often explained away or ignored entirely. The true horror began around 1970 when Coral started recruiting accomplices. David Owen Brooks was just 14 years old when Coral began grooming him, offering him money, drugs, and what seemed like friendship. Brooks, who came from a troubled home and was struggling in school, found in Coral what he thought was a mentor and father figure. What he actually found was a master manipulator who gradually normalized increasingly disturbing behavior until Brooks found himself participating in acts that would have horrified his younger self. The second accomplice, Elmer Wayne Henley, was recruited through Brooks when he was just 15. Henley was streetwise and tough, but he was also desperately poor and saw Coral's offers of money as a way to help support his family. Like Brooks, Henley was slowly drawn into Coral's web through a combination of financial incentives, emotional manipulation, and the gradual introduction of criminal activity that started small and escalated systematically. Coral's method was devastatingly effective. He would instruct his teenage accomplices to lure victims to one of his various residences around Houston, often with promises of parties, drugs, or simply a place to hang out. The victims, typically boys between 13 and 20 years old, were often runaways, kids from broken homes, or teenagers who were known to be rebellious and might not be immediately missed. Once at Coral's house, the victims would be offered alcohol or drugs that were laced with sedatives. When the victims lost consciousness, they would wake up to find themselves handcuffed to a specially constructed plywood torture board that Coral had built in his garage. What happened next defies comprehension. Coral would keep his victims alive for hours, sometimes days, subjecting them to prolonged torture and sexual assault before finally killing them, usually by strangulation or shooting them with a .22 caliber pistol. The torture board itself was a testament to the premeditated nature of these crimes, equipped with restraints and designed specifically to facilitate the prolonged suffering of his victims. The disposal of bodies was as methodical as everything else about Coral's operation. He had identified several locations around Houston where he could bury victims without detection. The primary site was a boat shed he rented on Silver Bell Street, where he buried multiple victims in lime to accelerate decomposition and reduce odor. Additional burial sites included remote areas near Lake Sam Rayburn and various locations along the Texas coast. Each site was carefully chosen for its isolation and the low likelihood of discovery. For over 3 years, this nightmare continued undetected. The Houston Police Department received missing person reports for many of the victims, but in an era when teenage runaways were common and often dismissed as temporary rebellions, few of these cases received serious investigation. Parents were often told their children would return on their own, and the idea that a single individual could be responsible for so many disappearances was simply beyond the scope of what law enforcement imagined possible. The end came on August 8th, 1973, in a way that no one could have predicted. Henley had brought two friends to Coral's house, a teenage boy named Tim Curley and a girl named Rhonda Williams. The presence of the girl enraged Coral, who had strict rules about his accomplices bringing females to his house. An argument ensued, during which Coral threatened to kill all three teenagers. In a moment of panic or clarity, Henley grabbed Coral's own .22 caliber pistol and shot him 6 times, killing him instantly. What happened next shocked even seasoned homicide investigators. Under interrogation, Henley began describing a murder operation that defied belief. He led police to the boat shed on Silver Bell Street, where they began excavating what would become one of the largest crime scenes in American history. Body after body was unearthed, many so decomposed that identification would take months or years. The victims were found wrapped in plastic bags, covered in lime, buried in mass graves that spoke to the industrial scale of Coral's operation. The investigation revealed the true scope of the horror. Coral had murdered at least 28 young men and boys, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in American history at that time. The victims ranged in age from 13 to 20, and many had been missing for months or years before their bodies were discovered. Some had been reported as runaways. Others had been the subjects of missing person investigations that had gone nowhere, and a few had never been reported missing at all. The impact on the Houston community was devastating. Parents who had been told their missing children were probably just acting out suddenly learned their sons had been tortured and murdered. The Houston Police Department faced intense criticism for their handling of the missing person cases, with many arguing that earlier action could have saved lives. The case forced a fundamental reevaluation of how law enforcement approached missing person cases, particularly those involving teenagers. Brooks and Henley were both tried and convicted for their roles in the murders. Brooks was sentenced to life in prison, while Henley received multiple life sentences. During their trials, additional details emerged about the systematic nature of Coral's operation and the psychological manipulation he used to control his accomplices. Both young men claimed they had been victims themselves, trapped in a situation they couldn't escape, though prosecutors argued they had been willing participants motivated by money and drugs. The full extent of Coral's crimes may never be known. Henley has suggested over the years that there were additional victims and burial sites that were never discovered. Some investigators believe the actual victim count could be as high as 40 or more, based on missing person reports from the time period and Henley's occasional hints about other crimes. However, without physical evidence or specific locations, these additional victims remain speculation rather than confirmed fact. What makes the Dean Coral case particularly haunting is how it revealed the vulnerability of young people who existed on society's margins. Many of his victims were boys who were struggling in school, having problems at home, or dealing with issues that made them easy targets for manipulation. Coral understood this vulnerability and exploited it with calculated precision, using small kindnesses and apparent understanding to lure victims into his trap. The case also highlighted the power of psychological manipulation in creating accomplices. Both Brooks and Henley were children when Coral began grooming them, and their transformation from potential victims to active participants in murder demonstrates the sophisticated nature of predatory behavior. Their stories serve as a chilling reminder of how easily young people can be manipulated by adults who understand how to exploit their needs and vulnerabilities. Today, the Coral case remains a watershed moment in the study of serial murder. It was among the first cases to demonstrate that serial killers could operate on a massive scale while remaining completely undetected by law enforcement and the community. The methodical nature of Coral's operation, from victim selection to body disposal, showed a level of organization and planning that challenged existing assumptions about how such crimes were committed. The candy factory that gave Coral his nickname has long since closed, and the various houses where he committed his crimes have been torn down or sold to unsuspecting buyers. The boat shed, where so many victims were buried, has been demolished, and Silver Bell Street looks like any other quiet residential area. But for those who remember the summer of 1973, when Houston learned that monsters don't always look like monsters, the scars remain fresh. The Coral case stands as a stark reminder that evil often wears the most innocent faces, and that the people we trust with our children may sometimes be the very ones we should fear most. Dean Coral's story is one of manipulation and hidden horror, but it's far from the only tale of evil masquerading as normalcy. Our next case takes us to a very different kind of predator, one who used a completely different facade to hide her deadly intentions. In the quiet rural communities of North Carolina during the 1970s, there lived a woman who seemed to embody everything wholesome about small-town America. She was a grandmother, a caregiver, someone who looked after the elderly and infirm with what appeared to be genuine compassion. Her name was Velma Barfield, and she would become known as the Death Row Granny, the first woman executed in the United States after the reinstatement of capital punishment. But Velma's story doesn't begin with murder. It begins with addiction, desperation, and a series of seemingly innocent relationships that would turn deadly. Born into poverty in rural North Carolina, Velma's early life was marked by hardship and struggle. She married young, had children, and tried to build a normal life. But beneath the surface, something dark was growing. The catalyst for Velma's transformation into a killer was her descent into prescription drug addiction. What started as legitimate medical treatment for anxiety and depression spiraled into a consuming dependency on tranquilizers and pain medications. As her addiction deepened, her need for money to feed her habit became desperate. She began forging checks, stealing from those who trusted her, and when the walls started closing in, she found a solution that was as simple as it was horrifying. Velma's first victim was her own mother, Lily Mae Bullard. In 1974, the elderly woman fell mysteriously ill with severe stomach problems. Velma, playing the role of the devoted daughter, cared for her mother during her final days. No one suspected that the very person nursing Lily Mae back to health was actually poisoning her with arsenic. The death was attributed to natural causes, and Velma inherited her mother's small estate. But killing her own mother was just the beginning. Over the next few years, Velma would poison at least 3 more people, each time using the same method, each time playing the role of the caring companion right up until the end. Her victims included Montgomery and Dolly Edwards, an elderly couple she worked for as a home health aide. Both died of mysterious stomach ailments while under Velma's care. The pattern was always the same. Velma would ingratiate herself with vulnerable elderly individuals, often becoming their caregiver or companion. She would forge their checks, steal their money, and when she feared discovery, she would slowly poison them with rat poison containing arsenic. The symptoms of severe stomach pain, vomiting, and gradual organ failure were often mistaken for natural illnesses common in elderly patients. Velma's method was insidious in its simplicity. Arsenic was readily available in rat poison, and she would mix small amounts into her victims' food or drinks over several days or weeks. The slow poisoning created symptoms that looked like natural illness, and because she was often the primary caregiver, she controlled the narrative of what was happening to her victims. Her final victim was Stuart Taylor, a man she had been dating. By 1978, Velma had been forging Taylor's checks to support her drug habit, and she became convinced he was growing suspicious. On February 1st, 1978, she mixed rat poison into his beer and tea. Taylor became violently ill, and Velma, maintaining her facade of concern, drove him to the hospital. He died several days later from arsenic poisoning. This time, however, the hospital staff was suspicious. Taylor's symptoms were severe and rapid, and the doctors ordered an autopsy. When the results came back showing lethal levels of arsenic in his system, police immediately focused on Velma. She was arrested and charged with murder. During her trial, the full scope of Velma's crimes began to emerge. Investigators exhumed the bodies of her previous victims and found arsenic in their remains. The prosecution painted a picture of a cold, calculating woman who had systematically murdered people who trusted her most. Her defense team argued that her severe drug addiction had impaired her judgment, that she hadn't fully understood the consequences of her actions. But the evidence was overwhelming. Velma had methodically poisoned 4 people over a span of 4 years, each time profiting from their deaths or avoiding consequences for her theft. The jury found her guilty and recommended the death penalty. What made Velma's case particularly disturbing was the betrayal of trust involved. These weren't random victims. They were people who had welcomed her into their lives, who had depended on her for care and companionship. She had looked them in the eye as they suffered from the poison she had given them, had comforted them as they died, had attended their funerals, and accepted condolences from their friends and families. During her time on death row, Velma underwent what she claimed was a religious conversion, becoming a born-again Christian and ministering to other inmates. She expressed remorse for her crimes and sought forgiveness from the families of her victims. Some believed her transformation was genuine, while others saw it as another manipulation, another attempt to avoid the consequences of her actions. Despite appeals for clemency based on her apparent religious conversion and her status as a woman, Velma's execution was carried out on November 2nd, 1984. She was administered lethal injection at North Carolina's Central Prison, becoming the first woman executed in the United States since 1962. The case of Velma Barfield reveals how evil can hide behind the most trusted relationships. She exploited society's assumption that grandmotherly figures are inherently safe and nurturing. Her victims never suspected that the woman caring for them was actually their killer. The very qualities that made her an effective caregiver, her access to vulnerable people, her ability to gain trust, her knowledge of their daily routines, also made her a perfect predator. Velma's crimes also highlight the devastating impact of addiction and how it can drive people to unthinkable acts. Her descent from a struggling mother trying to cope with life's pressures to a serial killer who murdered her own mother shows how addiction can strip away humanity and moral boundaries. Each murder was committed to cover up the previous crimes, creating a cycle of violence that only ended with her arrest. The investigation into her crimes was complicated by the fact that her victims were elderly and their deaths initially appeared natural. Arsenic poisoning, especially when administered in small doses over time, can mimic many common ailments. It was only when Stuart Taylor died rapidly from a large dose that suspicion was aroused. How many other elderly people might have died from poisoning by trusted caregivers, their deaths attributed to natural causes? Velma Barfield's legacy is one of betrayed trust and exploited vulnerability. She represents a particularly insidious type of killer, one who uses society's most sacred relationships, the bonds between caregiver and patient, family member and elder, to commit murder. Her case changed how we view the potential for evil in those we trust most, and highlighted the need for better oversight of caregivers and more thorough investigation of unexpected deaths among vulnerable populations. Her execution marked a milestone in American criminal justice, but her crimes serve as a lasting reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with violence and aggression. Sometimes it comes disguised as compassion, wearing the face of someone who has sworn to care for us when we are most vulnerable. Now we turn to Randall Woodfield, known as the I-5 Killer, a man whose story represents one of the most twisted falls from grace in criminal history. Picture this: a promising young athlete drafted by the Green Bay Packers, his future bright with possibility. Yet beneath that all-American exterior lurked something profoundly dark, something that would transform him into one of the Pacific Northwest's most feared predators. Randall Brent Woodfield was born on December 26, 1950, in Salem, Oregon, into what appeared to be the perfect American family: upper middle class, stable, supportive. His father worked as a successful businessman. His mother was active in community organizations. From the outside, the Woodfields looked like they had everything figured out. Randall excelled in school, but more importantly, he was a natural athlete. Football became his identity, his ticket to success, his pathway to the American dream. At Newport High School, Woodfield was unstoppable on the football field, 6 feet tall, powerfully built, with the kind of raw athleticism that made college scouts take notice. He was the golden boy, the star everyone looked up to, the young man who seemed destined for greatness. His teammates respected him, coaches praised him, and girls admired him. But even then, cracks were beginning to show in his perfect facade. During his high school years, Woodfield began exhibiting disturbing behavior that his coaches and teammates chose to ignore or cover up. He had a compulsion for indecent exposure, repeatedly exposing himself to unsuspecting women and girls. These weren't teenage pranks or moments of poor judgment. They were calculated acts that revealed something deeply wrong with his psychological makeup. When arrests occurred, his football coaches would intervene, speaking to police, downplaying the incidents, ensuring that their star player could continue to play. The pattern continued at Portland State University, where Woodfield's football prowess earned him recognition as one of the most talented players in the program's history. He was strong, fast, and aggressive on the field, qualities that made him a formidable opponent. Yet off the field, His criminal behavior was escalating. More arrests for indecent exposure, more incidents that should have raised serious red flags, more interventions by coaches who prioritized winning games over addressing his psychological problems. In 1974, Woodfield's athletic dreams reached their pinnacle when he was drafted by the Green Bay Packers in the 17th round of the NFL draft. This was it, the moment he had worked toward his entire life. Professional football, fame, fortune, everything he had ever wanted was within his grasp. He packed his bags and headed to training camp, ready to prove himself worthy of playing in the National Football League. But his dream lasted only weeks. During training camp, Woodfield's pattern of criminal behavior caught up with him. More arrests for indecent exposure, incidents that the Packers organization could not ignore or cover up. The team cut him before the season even began, ending his professional football career before it truly started. The rejection was devastating, a crushing blow that shattered his identity and his vision of his future. For most people, this setback might have been a wake-up call, an opportunity to seek help and change direction. For Woodfield, it became the catalyst for something far more sinister. The rage, humiliation, and sense of entitlement that had been building inside him for years finally found a new outlet. If he couldn't dominate on the football field, he would find other ways to exert power and control. After returning to Oregon, Woodfield's behavior became increasingly erratic and dangerous. He drifted between jobs, unable to find the success and recognition that football had once provided. The indecent exposure incidents continued, but now they were accompanied by more serious crimes. In 1975, he began committing armed robberies, often targeting women whom he would also sexually assault. His method was calculated and cruel. He would approach victims with a knife, rob them of their money and valuables, and then force them to submit to his sexual demands. The escalation was swift and terrifying. What had begun as inappropriate sexual behavior in high school had evolved into violent, predatory attacks. Woodfield seemed to take pleasure not just in the sexual gratification, but in the complete domination and terror he inflicted on his victims. He was methodical, choosing isolated locations, studying his targets, ensuring he had escape routes planned. This wasn't random violence, it was calculated predation. In 1975, Woodfield's luck ran out. He was arrested, convicted of second-degree robbery, and sentenced to 10 years in prison. For 4 years, he was locked away from society, apparently undergoing rehabilitation programs and psychological counseling. To prison officials and parole board members, he appeared to be making progress. He was articulate, seemingly remorseful, and claimed to have found purpose in education and self-improvement. In 1979, convinced that he had been rehabilitated, authorities granted him parole. They had made a catastrophic mistake. Within months of his release, Woodfield embarked on what would become one of the most brutal and extensive killing sprees in American history. But this time, he wasn't just robbing and assaulting women, he was murdering them. The I-5 corridor, stretching from Washington through Oregon and into California, became his hunting ground. Interstate 5 provided him with mobility, anonymity, and an endless supply of potential victims in the small towns and cities along the route. His first confirmed murder occurred in October 1980. Cherie Ayers, a 29-year-old woman who had actually known Woodfield from their high school days, was found bludgeoned and stabbed to death in her Portland home. The brutality of the attack was shocking even to experienced homicide investigators. She had been beaten with such force that her skull was fractured, then stabbed multiple times. The killer had spent time in her home, suggesting this wasn't a random break-in, but a targeted attack. But Cherie Ayers was just the beginning. Over the next year, Woodfield's killing spree expanded throughout the Pacific Northwest. His victims ranged in age from 14 to 37, each murder more brutal than the last. He would typically approach his victims under some pretense, gain their trust or overpower them, then subject them to sexual assault before killing them, usually by shooting them with a small caliber pistol. The geographical spread of the murders initially made it difficult for law enforcement agencies to recognize they were dealing with a serial killer. Crimes committed in Washington weren't immediately connected to those in Oregon or California. Communication between jurisdictions was limited, and the killer's mobility along the interstate system allowed him to stay ahead of investigations. Sherry Lynn Hull became his most well-documented victim, the case that would eventually lead to his capture. On January 18, 1981, Hull and her friend Beth Wilmot were working at the Transamerica Title Company office in Salem, Oregon, when Woodfield entered wearing a fake beard and carrying a gun. He forced both women into a back room, sexually assaulted them, then shot them both in the head. Hull died instantly, but miraculously Wilmot survived despite her severe injuries. Beth Wilmot's survival proved to be Woodfield's undoing. Despite her traumatic brain injury, she was able to provide investigators with crucial details about the attack. Her description of the perpetrator, combined with physical evidence from the scene, gave police their first solid leads in what had become a multi-state manhunt. The investigation that followed revealed the staggering scope of Woodfield's crimes. As detectives traced his movements along the I-5 corridor, a pattern of violence emerged that was almost incomprehensible in its scale. While he was ultimately convicted of only one murder, investigators linked him to at least 18 confirmed killings and suspected him in as many as 44 deaths across 3 states. His victims were primarily young women, many of whom were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Some were abducted from shopping centers or while walking alone. Others were attacked in their homes or workplaces. The randomness of his target selection made him even more terrifying to the communities along Interstate 5. No one felt safe because anyone could become his next victim. What made Woodfield particularly dangerous was his ability to appear normal, even charming, when it served his purposes. Unlike some serial killers, who are obviously disturbed or antisocial, Woodfield could blend into any environment. He was intelligent, articulate, and physically attractive. People trusted him, which made it easier for him to get close to his victims. The investigation also revealed the inadequacy of the criminal justice system in dealing with violent sexual predators. Despite his extensive history of sexual crimes and the clear escalation in his behavior, Woodfield had been released on parole after serving only 4 years of a 10-year sentence. The decision to grant him early release had directly enabled his killing spree, a fact that haunted the parole board members and prison officials involved in that decision. In 1981, Randall Woodfield was arrested and charged with the murder of Sherry Hull and the attempted murder of Beth Wilmot. The trial that followed was intense and highly publicized, as the full extent of his crimes became public knowledge. The prosecution painted a picture of a calculating predator who had used his intelligence and physical abilities to terrorize the Pacific Northwest for years. Woodfield's defense team attempted to argue that he was mentally ill, that his crimes were the result of psychological disorders stemming from his childhood and his traumatic rejection by the NFL. They brought in expert witnesses who testified about the psychological impact of his failed football career and suggested that he suffered from various personality disorders that impaired his judgment. The jury was not convinced. After deliberating for several hours, they found Woodfield guilty of murder in the first degree and attempted murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never again have the opportunity to hurt innocent people. Today, Randall Woodfield remains incarcerated at the Oregon State Penitentiary, where he has spent more than 4 decades behind bars. Now in his 70s, he continues to maintain his innocence in many of the crimes attributed to him, though he has never provided a satisfactory explanation for the overwhelming evidence against him. The case of the I-5 killer serves as a chilling reminder of how quickly a life can spiral from promise to predation. Woodfield had every advantage: athletic talent, intelligence, family support, and opportunities that most people never receive. Yet something inside him was fundamentally broken, something that transformed those advantages into tools for hunting and killing innocent people. His story also highlights the crucial importance of taking sexual crimes seriously, even when they seem minor. The pattern of escalation from indecent exposure to rape to murder is well documented in criminal psychology, yet Woodfield's early crimes were repeatedly overlooked or minimized because of his athletic achievements. How many lives might have been saved if his behavior had been properly addressed during his high school or college years? The victims of the I-5 killer were more than just statistics in a criminal case. They were daughters, mothers, sisters, friends, each with their own dreams and potential that were brutally cut short. Now we turn to one of the most chilling cases in this entire series, because this killer didn't lurk in dark alleys or abandoned buildings. He walked the sterile halls of hospitals, wore a white coat, and carried a stethoscope. His victims trusted him completely, placing their lives in his hands during their most vulnerable moments. Meet Michael Joseph Swango, the doctor who used his medical knowledge not to heal, but to kill. Born on October 21st, 1954, in Tacoma, Washington, Michael Swango seemed destined for a respectable career in medicine. He was intelligent, articulate, and ambitious. But beneath this polished exterior lurked something deeply disturbed. Even as a child, Swango displayed an unhealthy fascination with death and violence. While other kids played with toy cars, he collected newspaper clippings about disasters, accidents, and murders. He would spend hours reading about plane crashes and natural disasters, seemingly thrilled by the suffering of others. During his time at Southern Illinois University School of Medicine, Swango's classmates began to notice something unsettling. Patients under his care had an unusually high mortality rate. It was meant as a joke, but the pattern was undeniable. Wherever Swango went, death followed. The first major red flag came in 1984 during his internship at Ohio State University Hospital. Nurses began reporting a disturbing trend. Patients would be stable and recovering, but when Swango was on duty, they would suddenly suffer cardiac arrests or mysterious medical emergencies. The nursing staff grew so concerned that they started tracking his shifts, and the correlation was impossible to ignore. Yet hospital administrators dismissed these concerns, unwilling to believe that one of their own doctors could be deliberately harming patients. What made Swango particularly dangerous was his extensive knowledge of drugs and toxins. As a medical professional, he had access to a vast array of substances that could cause harm or death while appearing to be natural medical complications. He knew exactly which drugs would cause cardiac arrest, which would induce respiratory failure, and which would be difficult to detect in post-mortem examinations. His medical training had essentially given him the perfect toolkit for murder. In 1985, the facade began to crumble. While working as an EMT in Illinois after his medical license was suspended, Swango poisoned several of his co-workers by lacing their donuts with ant poison containing arsenic. His colleagues became violently ill, suffering from nausea, vomiting, and severe stomach pain. When investigators traced the poisoning back to Swango, they found a disturbing collection of poison and medical texts in his possession, along with detailed notes about various toxic substances. Swango was convicted of aggravated battery and sentenced to 5 years in prison, serving only 2 years. Most people would assume this conviction would end his medical career permanently. They were wrong. Through a web of lies, forged documents, and falsified resumes, Swango managed to obtain new medical positions, often in different states where his criminal history wasn't immediately apparent. His ability to continue practicing medicine despite his conviction reveals a terrifying failure in the medical licensing system. Swango would simply omit his criminal history from applications, forge references, and present himself as a dedicated physician looking for a fresh start. Hospital administrators, desperate to fill positions and often overwhelmed with paperwork, failed to conduct thorough background checks. In 1993, Swango secured a residency position at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Northport, New York. It was here that his killing spree reached its most documented and deadly phase. Over the course of several months, he murdered at least 3 patients: Thomas Samarco, George Ciano, and Aldo Serini. These weren't mercy killings or accidents. They were cold-blooded murders carried out for Swango's own twisted satisfaction. His method was chillingly calculated. He would inject patients with lethal doses of drugs, often claiming he was administering routine medication or pain relief. In some cases, he would falsely tell families that their loved one had requested "do not resuscitate" orders, making it easier to let them die without intervention. He would then watch as his victims suffered and died, sometimes even comforting grieving families with fake sympathy. The investigation into these deaths revealed the true extent of Swango's depravity. When bodies were exhumed and autopsied, toxicologists found traces of various poisons and drugs that had no legitimate medical purpose. The evidence was overwhelming, but by then, Swango had already moved on to his next position. Realizing that authorities in the United States were closing in, Swango fled the country in 1994. He managed to secure a position at the Menina Lutheran Mission Hospital in Zimbabwe, Africa. Even on a different continent, his deadly pattern continued. Within months of his arrival, hospital staff began noticing the same disturbing trend that had followed him throughout his career. Patients under his care were dying at an alarming rate. Zimbabwean authorities eventually issued a warrant for his arrest, suspecting him of poisoning 7 patients, 5 of whom died. But once again, Swango managed to slip away before he could be apprehended. He had become an international fugitive, a doctor who had turned his oath to do no harm into a license to kill. Swango's reign of terror finally ended in 1997 when he was arrested at Chicago's O'Hare International Airport. He had been attempting to board a flight to Saudi Arabia, where he had somehow managed to secure yet another medical position. Federal agents had been tracking him for months, and his capture represented the end of one of the most disturbing serial killing cases in American history. During the investigation and trial, the full scope of Swango's crimes became apparent. He had worked in hospitals across multiple states and countries, leaving a trail of suspicious deaths wherever he went. Investigators believe he may have been responsible for as many as 60 deaths, though the exact number will never be known. Many of his victims were elderly or seriously ill patients whose deaths didn't initially raise suspicion. What made Swango's case particularly horrifying was not just the number of victims, but the betrayal of trust it represented. Patients and families had placed their complete faith in him during some of the most vulnerable moments of their lives. They trusted him to heal, to comfort, to save lives. Instead, he used that trust to satisfy his twisted desire to control life and death. In 2000, Michael Swango pleaded guilty to 4 murders and was sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. During his sentencing hearing, he showed no remorse for his actions. He spoke in clinical terms about his crimes, as if discussing case studies rather than the lives he had deliberately ended. The Swango case exposed serious flaws in the medical licensing and hospital credentialing systems. It revealed how a determined individual could exploit bureaucratic gaps and institutional negligence to continue practicing medicine despite clear red flags. The case led to significant reforms in background checking procedures and information sharing between medical institutions. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Michael Swango's story is how he was able to hide in plain sight for so long. He appeared to be everything society expects from a doctor: educated, professional, and dedicated to helping others. He could discuss medical procedures with expertise, comfort grieving families with apparent compassion, and present himself as a caring physician. The nurses and staff who worked alongside him often sensed something was wrong, but the medical hierarchy and institutional culture made it difficult for their concerns to be taken seriously. Swango understood this dynamic and exploited it ruthlessly. He knew that his position as a doctor gave him a level of authority and trust that would shield him from suspicion. Today, Swango remains imprisoned at ADX Florence, a maximum security federal prison in Colorado. He will spend the rest of his life in solitary confinement, finally unable to harm anyone else. But the trauma he inflicted extends far beyond his direct victims. Families who lost loved ones under his care continue to struggle with the knowledge that their trust was so cruelly betrayed. The Michael Swango case serves as a stark reminder that evil can wear many faces, including those we trust most. It challenges our assumptions about who can be a killer and forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that sometimes the people sworn to protect us are the ones we should fear most. The Freeway Phantom case stands as one of the most chilling and frustrating mysteries in American criminal history. targeting young African American girls and women in a spree that would terrorize a community and expose deep flaws in how law enforcement responded to crimes against marginalized populations. The nightmare began on April 25th, 1971, when 13-year-old Carol Denise Spinks walked to a nearby 7-Eleven store in Temple Hills, Maryland. It was a routine trip, the kind any teenager might make on a Sunday evening. She bought some items and started the short walk home. She never made it. 6 days later, her body was discovered behind St. Elizabeth's Hospital near Interstate 295. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled. The green synthetic fibers found on her clothing would become a haunting signature that investigators would see again and again. What made Carol's murder even more disturbing was how methodical it appeared. Her body had been carefully positioned, her shoes were missing, and there were no signs that she had fought back in the location where she was found. This suggested she had been killed elsewhere and deliberately placed where she would be discovered. The killer wanted his work to be seen. Just over 2 months later, the pattern repeated with devastating precision. 16-year-old Darlenia Denise Johnson disappeared on July 8, 1971, while running an errand for her mother. Her body was found the next day, positioned almost exactly where Carol Spinks had been discovered. The same green fibers, the same missing shoes, the same methodical strangling. The proximity of the dump sites wasn't coincidental. See to its suburbs. The third victim was 10-year-old Brenda Faye Crockett, who vanished on July 27, 1971. Before her disappearance, something extraordinary and terrifying happened. Brenda called her family from an unknown location, telling them she had been kidnapped by a man who said he would take her to see her aunt. The call was brief and confusing, but it provided a crucial detail. The killer was keeping his victims alive, at least temporarily. Brenda's body was found 9 days later, following the same pattern as the previous murders. The fourth victim, 12-year-old Nenomoshia Yates, disappeared on October 1st, 1971, while walking home from a Safeway store. Her body was discovered within hours, but this time the killer had made a significant change. Instead of dumping her near the other victims, he left her body in a different area, suggesting he was aware of the police investigation and was adapting his methods to avoid detection. By this point, the media had begun connecting the murders and coined the term freeway phantom, referring to the killer's practice of leaving bodies along major roadways. The name stuck, but it also highlighted a troubling reality. These weren't random acts of violence. This was a serial killer operating with a clear pattern, and he was escalating. The fifth murder would prove to be the most psychologically disturbing. 18-year-old Brenda Denise Woodard disappeared on November 15th, 1971, after boarding a bus to visit her boyfriend. When her body was found the next day, investigators discovered something that sent chills through the entire investigative team. Tucked inside her coat pocket was a handwritten note that read, "This is tantamount to my insensitivity to people, especially women." The note was written in neat handwriting, suggesting education and deliberation. The freeway phantom wasn't just killing, he was taunting law enforcement and reveling in the fear he was creating. The psychological profile that emerged from this note was particularly disturbing. The killer demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of his own actions, acknowledging his insensitivity while simultaneously challenging police to catch him. The phrase, "I will admit the others," suggested there might be additional victims that hadn't been connected to the series. This wasn't a crime of passion or desperation. This was calculated psychological warfare against both his victims and the community trying to stop him. The final known murder occurred on September 5th, 1972, when 17-year-old Diane Denise Williams was abducted after getting off a bus near her home. But this time, the killer took his psychological games to an even more horrific level. He called Diane's family directly, telling them he had killed their daughter and describing where they could find her body. The call was brief but devastating, adding a new dimension of cruelty to his crimes. He wasn't content with just killing. He wanted to personally deliver the news of his victim's death to her loved ones. The investigation into the Freeway Phantom murders revealed troubling patterns in how law enforcement handled crimes against African American victims in the early 1970s. Many of the initial disappearances were classified as runaways rather than potential abductions, delaying crucial investigative work. The lack of resources dedicated to the case, combined with poor coordination between different law enforcement agencies, hampered efforts to catch the killer during his active period. Several suspects emerged over the years, but none could be definitively linked to all the murders. One of the most promising leads involved a man named Robert Askins, who was convicted of murdering another young girl in the area during the same time period. Askins had access to the locations where bodies were found, and his known methods shared similarities with the Freeway Phantom crimes. However, physical evidence linking him to all the murders was never established. Another suspect was Morris Warren, a truck driver who had knowledge of the highway system and had been in the area during the time of the murders. Warren was questioned extensively but never charged. The green fibers found on multiple victims were analyzed extensively, but investigators were never able to trace them to a specific source or suspect. The case took on additional complexity when investigators discovered that at least one of the victims had been kept alive for several days before being killed. This suggested the killer had a location where he could hold victims without being detected, adding another layer to the investigation. See area. No such location was ever identified. The Freeway Phantom case also highlighted the devastating impact of unsolved crimes on families and communities. The victims' families spent decades without answers, never knowing who killed their daughters or why. The lack of resolution created a persistent sense of vulnerability in the community, particularly among African American families who felt their children were not being adequately protected by law enforcement. Over the decades, the case has been reopened multiple times as new investigative techniques became available. DNA evidence collected from the crime scenes has been analyzed and reanalyzed, but the killer's genetic profile has never been matched to any individual in law enforcement databases. This suggests either that the killer died before DNA databases were established, or that he never committed another crime that would have required him to provide a DNA sample. The geographic pattern of the murders has been studied extensively by criminal profilers and investigators. See area, including backroads, highway systems, and locations where bodies could be disposed of without immediate detection. This suggested he was either a local resident or someone who spent significant time in the area for work or other reasons. Modern investigators have also examined whether the freeway phantom might have been responsible for other unsolved murders in the region during the same time period. Several cases involving young African American women who were found along highways share similarities with the known freeway phantom murders, but definitive connections have never been established. The case has been featured in numerous documentaries, podcasts, and books, keeping public attention focused on the unsolved murders. In recent years, investigative journalists and amateur sleuths have applied new analytical techniques to the evidence, hoping to identify patterns or connections that earlier investigators might have missed. One of the most frustrating aspects of the freeway phantom case is how close investigators came to potentially solving it during the active period. The killer's phone call to Diane Williams's family was traced to a payphone, but the location provided no useful leads. The handwritten note found with Brenda Woodard was analyzed by handwriting experts, but no matches were found in available databases. The green fibers were examined by textile experts, but their origin remained a mystery. The freeway phantom murders occurred during a period when serial killer investigations were less sophisticated than they are today. The concept of criminal profiling was in its infancy, and coordination between different law enforcement agencies was often poor. Many of the investigative techniques that might have been crucial to solving the case simply didn't exist or weren't widely used in the early 1970s. Despite the passage of more than 50 years, the freeway phantom case remains active in the files of multiple law enforcement agencies. SISI, Metropolitan Police Department, the FBI, and other agencies continue to review evidence and investigate new leads as they develop. The case has been featured on television shows like America's Most Wanted and Unsolved Mysteries, generating tips and potential leads that investigators continue to pursue. The psychological impact of the freeway phantom murders extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. See area, particularly in African American communities, where parents became afraid to let their children walk alone or use public transportation. The killer's ability to operate undetected for more than a year demonstrated a level of sophistication and planning that made him particularly terrifying. The freeway phantom case also became a symbol of broader issues related to how crimes against minorities were investigated and prosecuted in the 1970s. The delays in recognizing the pattern, the limited resources dedicated to the investigation, and the lack of community engagement all reflected systemic problems that extended far beyond this single case. Today, the freeway phantom remains one of the most significant unsolved serial killer cases in American history. The killer took 6 lives, terrorized a community, and then seemingly vanished without a trace. Whether he died, moved away, was incarcerated for other crimes, or simply stopped killing remains unknown. As highways. What made this case particularly devastating wasn't just the brutality of the crimes, but the systematic failures that allowed a killer to operate with near impunity for over a year. The investigation revealed uncomfortable truths about how society values certain lives over others, and how those biases can literally mean the difference between justice and abandonment. The killer's methodology was chillingly consistent, almost ritualistic in its precision. Abducted while going about their daily routines, sexually assaulted, strangled, and then carefully posed along major roadways. The removal of shoes became a signature element, along with the presence of mysterious green fibers found on several victims' clothing. These details suggested someone with intimate knowledge of police procedures, someone who understood exactly how to leave just enough evidence to taunt investigators while revealing nothing concrete about their identity. What emerged from witness statements and police reports was a portrait of someone who blended seamlessly into the community. Several witnesses described seeing the victims talking to a well dressed black man in his 20s or 30s, someone who appeared trustworthy enough that these cautious young women would willingly approach his vehicle. This wasn't a predator who relied on force for initial contact. Instead, he used charm, possibly posing as someone with authority or offering help in seemingly innocent situations. The psychological profile that emerged was particularly disturbing. The freeway phantom demonstrated escalating confidence with each murder, moving from simply disposing of bodies to actively taunting law enforcement and families. The handwritten note found in Brenda Woodard's pocket wasn't just a confession, it was a challenge. The killer was essentially daring police to catch him while simultaneously expressing a twisted philosophical justification for his actions. The phrase, tantamount to my insensitivity, to people, especially women, suggested someone educated, articulate, and deeply misogynistic. Even more chilling was the phone call made to Diane Williams's family. Imagine the psychological torture of receiving a call from your daughter's killer, calmly informing you that he had murdered her. This wasn't the act of someone in a rage or operating on impulse. This was calculated cruelty designed to maximize suffering, not just for the victim, but for everyone who loved her. The freeway phantom wasn't just killing these young women, he was weaponizing their deaths against their families and communities. The investigation itself became a study in institutional failure and systemic racism. Despite the clear pattern of murders, the case never received the resources or attention it deserved. Many of the initial disappearances were classified as runaways, a designation that effectively removed urgency from the search efforts. A predominantly black area that was already marginalized and underserved by law enforcement. Their deaths were treated as less significant than similar crimes might have been in wealthier, whiter neighborhoods. Detective work was hampered by poor communication between jurisdictions, inadequate forensic capabilities for the time period, and a general dismissive attitude toward crimes affecting the black community. Witnesses were sometimes not interviewed for weeks after crimes occurred. Evidence was mishandled or lost. The green fibers that appeared on multiple victims were never properly analyzed or compared to potential sources. What should have been crucial leads simply disappeared into bureaucratic incompetence. C. Families organized their own search efforts when police responses seemed inadequate. Parents began walking their children to school and implementing curfews. Churches held vigils and community meetings. But there was also a palpable sense of abandonment, a feeling that these families were facing this terror alone because their children didn't matter enough to the broader society. As months passed without arrests, fear calcified into resignation. The freeway phantom had succeeded in terrorizing an entire community while remaining completely anonymous. Parents couldn't let their daughters walk to corner stores. Children couldn't play outside without constant supervision. The killer had essentially imprisoned thousands of innocent people in their own homes through the psychological impact of his crimes. Then, as suddenly as the murders had begun, they stopped. After Diane Williams was found in September 1992, the freeway phantom vanished. No more bodies appeared along the highways. No more taunting messages surfaced. The killer simply melted back into anonymity, leaving behind 6 grieving families and a community forever changed by trauma. Over the decades that followed, the case went cold in official terms, but it never truly died. Family members continued pushing for answers. Amateur investigators and journalists periodically revisited the evidence. In recent years, podcasts and documentary series have brought renewed attention to the murders, introducing new generations to these forgotten victims and highlighting the injustices that allowed their killer to escape. Modern forensic techniques offer some hope for eventual resolution. DNA evidence that couldn't be processed in the 1970s might now yield crucial information. Digital databases can cross-reference patterns and suspects in ways that were impossible 50 years ago. Cold case units with fresh perspectives and better resources continue examining the evidence, looking for connections that earlier investigators might have missed. But the freeway phantom case represents something larger than just unsolved murders. It stands as a monument to institutional failure, systemic racism, and the price paid when society decides certain lives matter less than others. These weren't just random victims of a serial killer. They were daughters, sisters, friends, and students whose deaths were compounded by a system that failed to value their lives enough to pursue justice with full commitment. The killer may have stopped murdering, but he never stopped winning. Every day that passes without identification or arrest is another day that he has successfully evaded consequences for 6 murders. Every family gathering where a chair sits empty, every birthday that passes uncelebrated, every graduation or wedding where a daughter should have been present, represents the ongoing victory of evil over justice. The freeway phantom understood something fundamental about American society in the 1970s. He could kill young black women with relative impunity because the system was designed to minimize the importance of their deaths. He chose his victims not just for their vulnerability, but for their expendability in the eyes of law enforcement and media. His greatest crime wasn't just murder, it was the calculated exploitation of societal racism to enable and protect his killing spree. Today, the case serves as both a cold case challenge and a moral reckoning. Advanced forensic science might eventually identify the killer, but it cannot undo the failures that allowed him to operate freely for so long. The freeway phantom may remain a mystery, but the systemic problems that enabled his crimes are painfully clear. Now let's dive into the final figure in this horrific gallery of forgotten killers. Michael Joseph Swango wasn't just another serial killer hiding in the shadows. He was a predator who wore a white coat, carried a stethoscope, and took an oath to do no harm. Instead, he turned hospitals into hunting grounds and patients into prey. This is the story of a man who perverted the most trusted profession in society to satisfy his twisted need to kill. Michael Swango was born on October 21st, 1954, in Tacoma, Washington, into what appeared to be a respectable military family. His father was a career Army officer, and by all outward appearances, young Michael seemed destined for success. He was intelligent, articulate, and possessed the kind of charm that opened doors. But beneath that polished exterior lurked something fundamentally broken. From an early age, Swango displayed an unhealthy fascination with death and violence. While other children played with toys, he collected newspaper clippings about disasters, accidents, and murders. He kept detailed scrapbooks filled with images of carnage and tragedy, studying them with the intensity of a scholar. His classmates would later remember him as eerily calm during discussions of death, almost excited by the prospect of violence. Despite these disturbing tendencies, Swango excelled academically. He attended Quincy College in Illinois, where he majored in chemistry, a subject that would later prove instrumental in his killing methods. His professors remembered him as brilliant but odd, someone who asked too many questions about poisons and toxins. After college, he was accepted into Southern Illinois University School of Medicine, where his dark obsessions would finally find their perfect outlet. Medical school should have been where Swango learned to heal. Instead, it became his training ground for murder. Almost immediately, his classmates noticed something wrong. Patients under his care seemed to die at an alarming rate, earning him the grim nickname Double O Swango, a twisted reference to James Bond's License to Kill. During his clinical rotations, cardiac arrests and mysterious medical emergencies followed him like a shadow. Nurses began to whisper about the young medical student who always seemed to be present when patients took sudden turns for the worse. They noticed how he lingered around dying patients, how he volunteered for shifts in the ICU, how his eyes lit up when discussing terminal cases. But when concerns were raised to supervisors, they were dismissed. After all, Michael Swango was charming, articulate, and destined to become a doctor. Who would believe that someone sworn to preserve life was actually taking it? The first concrete evidence of Swango's criminal behavior emerged in 1984, not in a hospital, but in an ambulance service in Illinois where he worked part-time. Several of his co-workers became violently ill after eating donuts that Swango had brought to share. When investigators tested the remaining pastries, they found they had been laced with ant poison containing arsenic. Swango was arrested, tried, and convicted of aggravated battery. He served just 2 years of a 5-year sentence. Most people would assume that a felony conviction for poisoning would end any hope of a medical career. They would be wrong. Upon his release, Swango began an elaborate campaign of deception that would allow him to continue practicing medicine for nearly another decade. He forged documents, lied on applications, and created an entirely false narrative about his past. The fragmented nature of medical licensing and the lack of comprehensive background checks in the 1980s and 1990s created gaps that a clever sociopath could exploit. Swango's first position after prison was at Ohio State University Hospital, where he worked as a medical resident. Within months, the familiar pattern resumed. Patients under his care began dying unexpectedly. A previously healthy patient, named Rena Cooper, died suddenly after Swango administered what he claimed was a routine injection. Another patient, Ruth Barrick, died minutes after Swango entered her room. The hospital began an internal investigation, but before they could take action, Swango disappeared. He resurfaced at the State University of New York at Stony Brook, where he had somehow managed to secure a residency position despite his troubled past. Here, His killing spree reached its most documented and horrific peak. Between 1993 and 1994, at least 3 patients died under suspicious circumstances while in Swango's care. Thomas Samarco was a 73-year-old World War II veteran recovering from surgery when Swango volunteered to check on him during a night shift. Within hours, Samarco was dead. George Ciano, 60 years old and expected to recover fully from his procedure, died suddenly after Swango administered what he claimed was routine medication. Aldo Serini, another elderly patient, suffered the same fate. What made these murders particularly chilling was Swango's method. He would inject his victims with succinylcholine, a paralytic drug used in surgery that, when administered improperly, causes respiratory failure while leaving the victim conscious and aware of what's happening. They would die in terror, unable to move or cry out, while their trusted doctor watched them suffocate. Swango's colleagues began to notice his disturbing behavior. Nurses reported seeing him loitering around patients' rooms with no medical reason to be there. He was observed injecting patients with unmarked syringes, claiming they contained routine medications when questioned. Most disturbingly, several staff members noticed that he seemed energized and almost euphoric after his patients died, displaying an inappropriate excitement that made everyone uncomfortable. The investigation at Stony Brook finally began to close in on Swango in 1994. Hospital administrators started connecting the dots between his presence and the unusual number of deaths. They discovered his criminal history, his forged documents, and the trail of suspicious deaths that followed him from hospital to hospital. But once again, Swango managed to stay one step ahead. Before authorities could arrest him, he fled the country. Swango's next destination was Zimbabwe, where he found work at the Menena Lutheran Mission Hospital. The developing nation's less stringent credentialing process and desperate need for doctors made it easy for him to obtain a position. Far from the scrutiny of American medical boards, Swango's killing spree continued with even less oversight. At the Mission Hospital, 7 patients died under suspicious circumstances while in Swango's care. 5 of these deaths were later determined to be homicides. Local authorities began their own investigation, but Swango's charm and the hospital's gratitude for having any doctor at all initially protected him from serious scrutiny. The end finally came in 1997 when Swango attempted to board a flight from Chicago to Saudi Arabia, where he had somehow secured yet another medical position. Alert customs officials, acting on an international warrant, arrested him at O'Hare Airport. The man who had evaded justice for over a decade was finally in custody. The investigation that followed revealed the true scope of Swango's crimes. Exhumations of his suspected victims confirmed the presence of various poisons in their remains. Succinylcholine, potassium chloride, and other substances that would cause cardiac arrest were found in tissue samples from multiple patients across different hospitals and even different continents. In 2000, facing overwhelming evidence and the possibility of the death penalty, Michael Swango pleaded guilty to 4 murders and multiple counts of fraud. He was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. During his sentencing, families of his victims finally had the chance to confront the man who had betrayed the most fundamental trust in society. But the true horror of the Swango case lies not just in the confirmed murders, but in the scope of what may never be fully known. Investigators believe he may have been responsible for as many as 60 deaths across the United States and Zimbabwe. His medical career spanned over a decade, during which he worked in multiple hospitals, had access to countless vulnerable patients, and possessed both the knowledge and means to kill without detection. The Swango case exposed critical flaws in the medical system that allowed a known felon to continue practicing medicine. Hospitals failed to conduct thorough background checks. Medical boards didn't communicate effectively across state lines, and the culture of protecting fellow physicians prevented many from speaking out about their suspicions. Perhaps most chilling of all was Swango's own explanation for his crimes. In journal entries discovered after his arrest, he wrote about the sweet, husky, close smell of indoor homicide and described the act of killing as providing him with an indescribable rush of power and control. He didn't kill for money, revenge, or passion. He killed because he enjoyed it, and the medical profession provided him with the perfect cover. Today, Michael Swango sits in solitary confinement at ADX Florence, the federal supermax prison in Colorado. He's now in his 70s, spending his days in a concrete cell, cut off from the world he terrorized for so long. But the victims he claimed, the families he destroyed, and the trust he shattered in the medical profession remain as his permanent legacy. The case of Michael Swango serves as a stark reminder that evil doesn't always lurk in dark alleys or abandoned buildings. Sometimes it wears scrubs, carries a medical degree, and hides behind the oath to first do no harm. In a profession built on trust, compassion, and healing, Swango represents the ultimate betrayal, a predator who weaponized medicine itself to satisfy his need to kill. These 5 cases, Dean Corll, Velma Barfield, Randall Woodfield, the Freeway Phantom, and Michael Swango, represent some of the most disturbing examples of serial murder in American history. What makes them particularly chilling isn't just the brutality of their crimes, but how they exploited the trust and vulnerabilities of society itself. Behind the antiseptic corridors of American hospitals, beneath the white coats and medical degrees, lurked a killer so calculating, so methodical, that he turned the very profession meant to save lives into his personal hunting ground. Michael Joseph Swango didn't need to stalk victims in dark alleys or break into homes. His victims came to him willingly, desperate and vulnerable, seeking healing. Instead, they found death. Born in Tacoma, Washington, in 1954, Michael Swango seemed destined for greatness. Intelligent, charismatic, and driven, he sailed through his early education with the kind of academic excellence that opens doors. But beneath that polished exterior, something was fundamentally broken. As a child, Swango displayed an unusual fascination with violence and death. He collected newspaper clippings about disasters, accidents, and murders. He seemed to take pleasure in others' suffering, a trait that should have been a red flag, but was often dismissed as morbid curiosity. In college, Swango's obsessions intensified. He wrote disturbing essays about violence, including one titled Murder, that contained graphic descriptions of killing. His professors were concerned, but Swango was an excellent student, and his academic performance overshadowed these warning signs. He graduated with honors and was accepted to Southern Illinois University School of Medicine, where his true nature would begin to emerge. During medical school, Swango's classmates noticed something unsettling. Patients under his care had an unusually high mortality rate. They began calling him Double O Swango, a dark reference to James Bond's License to Kill. But these weren't just jokes among students. Nurses reported that Swango seemed excited by medical emergencies, that he volunteered for night shifts where he could be alone with patients, and that mysterious cardiac arrests and respiratory failures seemed to follow him from ward to ward. The first concrete evidence of Swango's murderous nature came not in a hospital, but at an ambulance service in Quincy, Illinois. In 1984, after being dismissed from his medical residency due to concerns about his behavior, Swango took a job as an emergency medical technician. His new colleagues quickly fell ill after eating food he had prepared. They suffered from severe nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. When investigators tested the leftover donuts Swango had brought to work, they found they had been laced with arsenic and other poisons. Swango was arrested and convicted of aggravated battery. But even as he sat in court, listening to his sentence, there was no remorse in his eyes, only calculation. He served just 2 years of his 5-year sentence, and upon his release, he did something that exposed the terrifying flaws in America's medical system. He resumed his medical career. Using forged documents and fabricated references, Swango obtained a residency at the State University of New York at Stony Brook. He had learned to be more careful, more subtle. Instead of obvious poisonings that left multiple victims, he began targeting individual patients, vulnerable people who were already sick, whose deaths wouldn't raise immediate suspicion. At Stony Brook, Swango's method was refined and horrifying. He would inject patients with lethal doses of drugs, often during night shifts when fewer staff members were around. His victims included George Ciano, a 60-year-old patient recovering from surgery, and Thomas Samarco, who was admitted for a minor procedure and died unexpectedly after Swango administered what he claimed was medication. What made Swango particularly dangerous was his ability to manipulate the system. He would falsify medical records, claiming that patients had given do not resuscitate orders when they hadn't. He forged family consent forms. He used his medical knowledge to select poisons that would mimic natural causes of death. And when suspicions arose, he would simply move to another hospital, another state, another country. The scope of Swango's crimes became clear only after years of investigation. At the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Northport, New York, he murdered at least 3 patients between 1993 and 1994. Each death was carefully planned. Aldo Serini, a 73-year-old World War II veteran, was injected with a lethal dose of epinephrine. His family was told he had suffered a heart attack. They had no reason to doubt the word of a doctor. But Swango's arrogance would eventually be his downfall. Nurses and colleagues began to notice patterns. Patients who were stable would suddenly crash when Swango was on duty. Family members reported that their loved ones seemed afraid of him. One nurse discovered Swango in a patient's room at an unusual hour, holding a syringe he couldn't adequately explain. As investigations intensified, Swango fled the United States. He found work at a mission hospital in Zimbabwe, where his killing spree continued. Far from American oversight, with limited resources for investigation, Swango had found what he thought was the perfect hunting ground. He allegedly poisoned at least 7 patients at the Menena Lutheran Mission Hospital, 5 of whom died. The hospital staff, lacking experience with such systematic murder, initially attributed the deaths to the harsh conditions and limited medical resources. But even in Zimbabwe, Swango's pattern was too obvious to ignore. When authorities began to investigate, they found evidence of deliberate poisoning. A warrant was issued for his arrest, but Swango had already disappeared, fleeing back toward the United States with plans to take another medical position, this time in Saudi Arabia. His final capture came in 1997 at Chicago's O'Hare International Airport. Federal agents, who had been tracking him for months, arrested him as he attempted to board a flight to Saudi Arabia. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Exhumed bodies showed traces of poison. Medical records revealed falsified documents. Former colleagues testified about his suspicious behavior and the mysterious deaths that followed him. In 2000, Michael Swango pleaded guilty to 4 murders and was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. But the true scope of his crimes may never be known. Investigators believe he may have killed as many as 60 people across multiple countries and continents. Each victim was someone's father, mother, child, or spouse. Each death was a life cut short by a man who had taken an oath to do no harm. Swango's case exposed critical flaws in how medical professionals are monitored and licensed. His ability to move between hospitals, states, and countries revealed gaps in background checking and credential verification that have since been addressed, though many argue not comprehensively enough. The case led to reforms in medical licensing and the creation of databases to track physicians with problematic histories. Today, Michael Swango sits in ADX Florence, the Supermax federal prison in Colorado, serving his life sentences. He is now 70 years old, his hair gray, his face lined with age. He doesn't grant interviews, doesn't write letters, doesn't seek attention, but the families of his victims still live with the knowledge that the person they trusted to heal their loved ones was instead a predator who used his position to kill. The Michael Swango case remains one of the most chilling examples of how evil can hide behind professional credentials and social respectability. It demonstrates how systems designed to protect can be manipulated by those determined to cause harm. These 5 cases represent some of the most chilling examples of how evil can hide behind the masks of normalcy, trust, and societal respectability. Dean Corll operated behind the innocent facade of a candy maker, using sweets to lure children to their deaths. Velma Barfield exploited the trust placed in caregivers, poisoning those who depended on her most. Randall Woodfield transformed from celebrated athlete to highway predator, using his charm as a weapon. The freeway phantom capitalized on systemic neglect and racial bias, targeting vulnerable young women while taunting authorities. Michael Swango perverted the sacred oath to do no harm, turning hospitals into hunting grounds. What makes these killers particularly terrifying isn't just the scope of their crimes, but how they exploited the fundamental structures of society. They weaponized trust, manipulated authority, and preyed upon society's most vulnerable members. Their stories reveal uncomfortable truths about how easily evil can flourish when it wears the right disguise. The Candyman's factory became a house of horrors where children's screams were muffled by the sounds of machinery. The death row granny's kitchen table became an altar of poison where family meals turned deadly. The I-5 killer's athletic prowess became a tool for overpowering victims along America's highways. As streets became a roadmap for terror, the doctor's stethoscope became an instrument of death rather than healing. These cases also highlight the systemic failures that allowed these killers to operate for so long. Police dismissed missing children as runaways. Hospitals overlooked suspicious death patterns. Athletic programs covered up criminal behavior to protect promising careers. Communities ignored the disappearances of marginalized victims. Medical boards failed to adequately screen and monitor dangerous practitioners. The psychological profiles of these killers reveal disturbing patterns. Many showed early signs of antisocial behavior that were either ignored or inadequately addressed. They demonstrated an extraordinary ability to compartmentalize their crimes while maintaining seemingly normal public lives. They exploited positions of trust and authority, understanding that society's guardians would be the last suspects in anyone's mind. Perhaps most chilling is how they evolved and refined their methods over time. Coral perfected his system of using teenage accomplices to lure victims. Barfield learned to use poison in ways that mimicked natural illness. Woodfield developed a mobile killing strategy that crossed state lines. The freeway phantom grew increasingly bold, even calling victims' families. Swango mastered the art of medical murder while building an international career. The impact on their communities was devastating and long-lasting. Houston's sense of safety was shattered when mass graves revealed the true scope of Coral's crimes. North Carolina grappled with executing their first woman in decades. The Pacific Northwest lived in fear as bodies accumulated along major highways. This black community felt abandoned by law enforcement's inadequate response. Hospitals worldwide questioned their hiring practices and oversight procedures. These cases remind us that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. It can smile from behind a candy counter, serve dinner at the family table, sign autographs after football games, patrol city streets, or make rounds in hospital wards. The most dangerous predators are often those who've learned to blend seamlessly into the fabric of society. The investigation and prosecution of these cases also revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of American law enforcement. Some cases, like Coral's, were solved through dramatic confessions. Others, like Barfield's, required meticulous forensic work to prove poisoning. Woodfield's capture involved multi-state cooperation and pattern recognition. The Freeway Phantom case exposed the consequences of inadequate resources and attention. Swango's prosecution required international cooperation and extensive documentation of his fraudulent career. The legal outcomes varied significantly. Coral died before facing trial, killed by his own accomplice in a moment of self-preservation. Barfield became a symbol in the death penalty debate, executed despite claims of religious redemption. Woodfield received multiple life sentences, though the full extent of his crimes may never be known. The Freeway Phantom remains free, the case unsolved after more than 50 years. Swango sits in federal prison, finally stopped but possibly responsible for dozens more deaths than he was charged with. These stories serve as stark reminders that the monsters among us don't always look like monsters. They remind us to trust our instincts when something feels wrong, to take seriously the concerns of vulnerable community members, and to maintain robust oversight of those in positions of trust and authority. They also highlight the importance of remembering the victims, not just the perpetrators. Each number in these body counts represents a life cut short, a family destroyed, a community traumatized. Behind every statistic is a human story of dreams unfulfilled, potential unrealized, and love lost forever. The legacy of these cases continues to influence how we approach child safety, elder care, athletic programs, urban policing, and medical oversight. They've led to improved background check systems, better interagency communication, enhanced forensic capabilities, and increased awareness of the warning signs of dangerous behavior. As we've seen throughout this exploration, evil can hide behind the most trusted faces in our society. It can operate in our neighborhoods, our hospitals, our highways, and even our families. These 5 killers prove that vigilance, not paranoia, is the price of safety. They remind us that the capacity for both good and evil exists within human nature, and that eternal vigilance is required to protect society's most vulnerable members from those who would exploit and destroy them. The stories of Dean Corll, Velma Barfield, Randall Woodfield, the Freeway Phantom, and Michael Swango will forever serve as chilling reminders that sometimes the most dangerous predators are those we least suspect, hiding in plain sight behind masks of respectability, trust, and authority.